Hey, welcome back to my channel. It's Emma. I'm very excited to be bringing you this first video filmed in my little reading nook because I haven't actually sat down here yet to film a video, so I'm quite excited. I'm feeling very wrapped in books. I hope you have a snack or a drink or both because I somehow got through 16 books this month. However, a lot of that came during the DA Halloween-a-thon or the readathon that we hosted, the Dark Academics Book Club hosted, which took place during the last 2 weeks of October, and during that time I managed to somehow get through 10 books. So I think this time I'm just gonna go chronologically, although of course I am going to start with my favorite book of the month, which probably everyone already knows, but that's okay. And then we're just gonna go through it chronologically because I have a lot to say about kind of the readathon and the prompts and the Halloween things. So I hope you are cozy and I don't know what that was. Let's wrap it up. And as is now tradition, this is the way. We're gonna be going through, or at least I'm gonna be going through my favorite word that I learned from each book, if I did learn a word. So my favorite book of the month is now also my most annotated book that I own because it was a reread for me. It's my favorite novel of all time. Is it the best book I've ever read? No, but is it my favorite? Yes. That book is The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. I just absolutely obsessed. I'm just obsessed. I had the time of my life going through and annotating absolutely everything in this book. It was so fun. I honestly had the best reading time of my life going through this book, going through every page, picking things out, finding things. And when you reread a book again for another time, it's almost like a little treasure hunt of maybe things you missed along the way or stuff like that, and things that you've now grown and can see more clearly because you have read more things or you've just changed as a person each time you come back to a book for the first time again. And The Phantom of the Opera was just everything I wanted stepping back in. So this was also one of our book club picks for the month of October, and if you don't know what this is about, we are following this masked menace, the Phantom Menace. If I got Star Wars on the brain, I don't know what's going on, but there is this masked man, and he lives, maybe he's a man, he lives beneath the Paris Opera House in the bowels, and there is so much attributed to him: crime, supernatural things, things that go wrong, anything vaguely superstitious that happens. Everyone in the Opera House attributes it to the ghost. It's the ghost, the opera ghost, the OG, that's making it happen. Things start to kind of drift outside of this formula of ghostliness within the opera house when a young singer named Christine Daae takes the stage and wows Paris and the audience because she has this voice that is seemingly impossible because it is so nice. From there, this book just follows a whole host of things that go down mostly by the opera ghost's hand: abductions, crime, blackmailing, everything like that. And it is just such a beautiful novel about neglect and about love and about music, and it's just absolutely beautiful. There's many things I like about this novel. Just to give you a few, we have a first-person detective persona, kind of maybe Gaston Leroux, where he takes on this detective guise because this is one of the first French detective novels. We also have gothic elements because this is also a gothic novel being set primarily and almost entirely within the Paris Opera House in Paris, France. We have beautiful, beautiful prose and writing and pacing, which isn't something I too often expect from a detective novel, but there were so many wonderful lines that I got to tab in here in green. I cannot praise this enough. There's really nothing that could come out of my mouth right now that would even equal the amount of love that is in the organ of my heart for this book. So that is The Phantom of the Opera. So glad I got to read it again and to read it with all of you guys. Thank you so much to those who joined us at our live show. It is always such a fun time with you guys, and we always end up laughing at the absolute strangest things. I just can't wait for all the many more places I know I'm gonna go with this book because I just want to write upon it so much, essay upon essay, because there's just so much I have to say. So that is Phantom. Highly recommend. A word that, oh, let me get my checkboard. The word that I learned from Phantom, I learned a lot, but this one was kind of cool. It's farandole, and a farandole is a lively provincial dance where people get together, hold hands, form a chain, and follow a leader through a serpentine course. So it's just this kind of dance that goes on in the opera because there's lots of different scenes and music and dance and theater and art, but it comes from the French word farandole, and from there it actually comes from Occitan? Is that how you pronounce that language? From Farandulo. So very cool. The first book I read in October, though, we started off with a spooky murder mystery by Agatha Christie, and I read Murder on the Links. This is her second book in the Hercule Poirot series, and I loved it. I haven't read the first, but I will get there. I did just want to start the series like from the beginning. However, this was the audiobook that was available, so I decided to go with this one. In this one, we are following Poirot as he gets this letter from this man in France named Monsieur Renaud, and he is beseeching Poirot to come to his abode, come to his estate. He lives in quite this sprawling mansion that overlooks this newly constructed golf course called the Links. And as soon as Poirot gets there, we find out that Monsieur Renaud is actually dead on the floor, stabbed in the back. From there, the game is set afoot, and we follow him and his friend who navigate this house. They interview the servants and the people who live there, Monsieur Renaud's wife and everything like that. This one had some interesting quirks. I've only read a few Agatha Christie novels, but this one in particular has kind of this arch nemesis rival that comes in, who is a detective from Paris named Giraud, and he is the complete opposite of Poirot, so it's fun to see that rivalry. I did really enjoy this, although I think it might be my least favorite Agatha Christie I've read. Not that it was dry, because things are always happening. It was exciting. It was fun to try and follow the clues and piece together what had happened yourself. Plot and the aspects of the murder were a little bit just standard and very average for me, so it was fine. I gave it 4 stars because I do really, really love Agatha Christie's books and her writing and her mysteries. So that is the first one I read. I wish I had like a little musical segment for each new word. That would be fun. Anyway, the word that I learned is garrulous, which means given to prosy, rambling, or tedious loquacity, pointlessly or annoyingly talkative. It comes from the Latin verb garrire, which means to chatter. Then we move on to the worst book I've ever read in my life, I think, and certainly this month and certainly this year. That is Tantalized by Cynthia Leitich Smith. Of course, these are all my own personal thoughts and opinions and just my own personal preferences and tastes, but it was the kind of book where I started it and I got maybe 10 pages through before I had to tell myself, you have to enter that state where you can't be mad any longer at the book for being bad. You can only laugh and find it funny and just enjoy the ride. This was a dumpster fire. You could not pull your eyes away if you wanted to, even as they burned in their sockets. Let's start with the word, and then I'll tell you what this is about. So the word I learned, thankfully, we learned a word from this book. That's amazing. I don't even care if it's bad because each book is a new experience. It's fun. The word I learned is insouciance, which means light-hearted unconcern, from the French verb insoucier, which means to trouble. And then the French traces all the way back again to Latin solicitare. So, This book, we follow this girl named Quincy. Her name is Quincy, and she is an orphan, and she is set to inherit her family's restaurant that her mother and father owned before they died, which is currently in the care of her uncle, who is owning it and running it and helping her with it before she comes of age to inherit it. The restaurant is kind of this crumbling old Italian family restaurant, and for this Halloween season, because this book takes place during the Halloween festivities, they decide that to outdo and outshine their competitors, they need to turn the restaurant into Dracula's castle. And the main selling point of the spooky restaurant is that they're going to hire this chef, and the chef of the restaurant, not only is he gonna make your meals, but he is going to personify and be the vampire prince of this restaurant castle. Right, so for some reason, Quincy, even though she is a 17-year-old high school student, also stumbling to run her day job as the hostess of this restaurant, is now tasked with hunting down, finding, and training the head chef of their restaurant, which turns out to be this dude named Brad. To make matters worse, Quincy is hopelessly in love with her best friend, who also turns out to be a werewolf. The thing with this book, I knew it was going to be supernatural, because in the synopsis, we know that werewolves exist. We know that Quincy's best friend and love interest is a werewolf. However, what I didn't know, what we didn't know until it is literally just dropped on you, so strangely, we have a scene where the audiobook flips over to the next chapter. Quincy walks into her bedroom and she trips and stumbles over this half armadillo, half man creature. It was the weirdest scene I've ever read in a book. It was so strange. I think objectively some of the worst writing I did not write this book. Some of the worst writing I've witnessed in my life. People just did and said things, and we're never really sure who anyone is in this book because it's just the most randomly occurring, randomly generated kind of book. It was like randomly generating scenes in like some Google generator to write a book, because we'd have a scene that would somehow cut into the next and I wouldn't know where we even were anymore. We'd start a chapter and Quincy would, at least in my mind, would be alone in the graveyard, and then suddenly she would be talking to her best friend who was just there. To top that all off, it was just so absurd, so hilariously bad. To give you an idea of some of my favorite lines in this book, I've saved a lot of them for the video I'm planning, so these are by no means the worst. These are like the best of the worst. So we have Quincy talking about Brad, the vampire chef. It was like Brad and I were developing some sort of a vibe. His official status may have been undead, but he was totally dead to me. And my favorite, he smelled like olive oil and paradise. I gave it 1 star, but I'm not mad about it. All right, let's move on to something amazing. I read this beautiful, beautiful essay called We Should All Be Feminists. This is a very short, very famous essay by the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and I just loved it. So clear, so concise. It was like crystalline water where you just know exactly what is being said to you and are so appreciative of the stillness and the calmness and the clearness with which words are being given to you, and it was just beautiful. The audiobook was incredible. The author narrates the audiobook, which was even better, and I just loved it. I gave it 4 stars. This is an essay detailing more, I want to say, introductory and basic premises and arguments, and it introduces you a little bit to feminism, especially from the author's point of view. She tells a lot about her personal life, her personal experiences with inequality between the sexes, and it was just wonderful. I highly recommend it to absolutely everyone. I am so interested in reading more of her work, so 4 stars, adored. A book I had no idea what my thoughts would be on it because I wasn't really sure what this book was really going to turn out to be was The Doll Factory by Elizabeth McNeil. I actually ended up loving it so much. I gave it 4 stars. It was creepy, it was spooky, it mastered the creeping, crawling little centipede of doom that winds its way through every page of this book, and it was great. So for a little background, The Doll Factory is set in 1851, I believe, and we're following a few different people in Victorian London who all appear quite different and not alike in any respect at all, except that they are actually quite similar once the story sets itself in motion. We are following their ideals, their want and their quest for art, for power, for ideal, and for beauty among all else. This book has a lot of historical fiction elements. I say that because we are following a fake made-up member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood that got its start in England and is composed of people like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Ford Madox Brown, William Waterhouse, Millay, and everything like that. They're the very, very famous paintings. I actually have one right here. Where are you? Oh, where did you go? For example, this is one, the very famous painting of Ophelia by Millay. This one, if you're interested, by Rita Cameron, Ophelia's Muse, is more historical fiction because it does follow the affair, very true to life, of Dante Gabriel Rossetti and the model for Ophelia's Muse, Lizzie Siddal, and their tragic relationship. I read this last year. Did like it, but I did actually prefer The Doll Factory. In this one, we are following Louis Frost, who is the made-up member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and we are following 2 sisters who are twins, Iris and Rose. Iris is our protagonist, and as this book sets off, she is working in a doll factory, or a place which makes dolls to commemorate living and dead children for parents who want to have dolls made of their children. Quite morbid. There's already so much in there, and that kind of theme of creation and manipulation and idealism just absolutely spreads its wings and flies over this whole novel. It was beautiful to see. It was not something I was really expecting out of this book, and I was so pleased with it. I loved it. Frost, of course, is trying to get his start and trying to find the perfect model. So when he gets introduced to Iris, he absolutely beseeches her to leave the doll factory and model for him, which, with a lot of trouble and a lot of questioning she eventually does. The force and the person that makes this book absolutely horrifying and scary. Not only elements of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was just touched on so beautifully, the idea of idealism and this really dangerous ideological thinking that everyone to an extent in this novel is engaged in, but the one who takes it so far, takes it outside the realms of sanity, is this man called Silas, who runs kind of a curiosity shop in which he takes dead animals and transforms them into trinkets and baubles and consumable objects for the public, the Victorian public, who at that time is so enamored with weird, strange, morbid, dead things. He is very obsessive and particular about his creations, and unfortunately for everyone in this novel, he meets Iris and sees her at the Great Exhibition in London, which was taking place in that year as well. And from the moment he sees her, he instantly associates and thinks all these things about her, and in his mind, she becomes something different than what she really is. So you follow mostly these three people as they go about their lives. Iris wants to be a painter as well. It's all she's ever wanted, and she tries her best to convince Louis to teach her. Art and madness and this idealism that just is so brilliantly haunting in this novel all combined to just make this book, The Doll Factory. It was just so good. I gave it 4 stars. Honestly, maybe 4.5. I think I might get it for myself now because I would like to actually own it. I loved it. Highly recommend. It did so many things so wonderfully. It discussed elements of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was just so interesting. I think the last thing I want to say about it is that Iris, the words that Elizabeth McNeill puts in her mouth about their painting and about their kind of whole mission in creating the Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was to pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was to step away from the norms and the average and the very constructed art that was kind of the thing of the day back then, and to kind of create this depiction of reality and truth. But in doing so, and in creating scenes that are so famous from Shakespeare's plays and from mythology and from the stories and folktales and scenes that are unreal in and of themselves, Iris points out that their work is actually so idealistic and not very true at all. I absolutely loved that take and that commentary on this art movement, which I hadn't really read about in that light in any novel or nonfiction since this one, so loved it. I've talked too much about it. Let's move on. The word I learned is acrimony, which is anger and bitterness, especially in words, manner, and feelings. So it comes from the Middle French acrimonie, from the Latin acrimonia, which means sharp and biting. Next, I read a young adult romance called Of Curses and Kisses by Sandia Menon. The word I learned from this is expatiate, which means to speak or write at length or in detail of, and it comes from the Latin expatiatus, I feel like I just cast a spell, which means to wander or digress. I'm going to talk super briefly about this because this was quite a big letdown. This book follows 2 sisters who are princesses and have just moved from their family from India to the United States to go to boarding school. They're moving to the United States because the younger sister Isha has just had quite the scandal in India. Lots of pictures have been released of her, and so they're moving to the United States to kind of just die down while the media does what it does. Jaya, the older sister though, actually has quite the mission when she gets to this boarding school because she is part, along with her sister, of the Rao dynasty. Dinosaurs. There is a boy who attends the boarding school named Gray Emerson, and unfortunately Gray is part of the Emerson family who years ago stole a ruby from the Rao family, and the family has never given it back over the course of history and years and years and years. There's also a curse that is said to be in this ruby because Jaya's great-great-great-grandmother, I believe, cursed the ruby and cursed the Emerson family. So Jaya's plan, in order to get revenge on the Emerson family and on Gray Emerson, who actually released the photos of her younger sister, is to make Gray fall in love with her and break his heart. I was really looking forward to this romance, to this kind of enemies to lovers trope, and to everything that was going to go on at the boarding school. However, I kind of had a few main problems with it. The first one is that I think this book could have had a lot more editing and a lot more cutting down of scenes. It was quite a long book for what it was, and I do not think every single scene had to be there. It felt so long, it felt dragging, at times it felt quite boring and hard to get through. I also did not like either of our protagonists, Jaya or Gray. I thought they were both not flat, but certainly not round, kind of somewhere in this weird middle ground where certain parts of their characters were fleshed out quite large and some of their character attributes were just seemingly overtaking all they were, and other parts were just quite flat. I actually loved our supporting cast of characters so much more than these two people. Combine that with the fact that I don't think they had like any chemistry or any like great scenes together. I just didn't feel like they clicked. I didn't feel anything between them, which is not something you want to be saying about a romance, especially the protagonist. I just really don't feel like they had any chemistry. If anyone has read it, definitely let me know your thoughts, but I did not enjoy this one very much at all, which was quite a disappointment. I think I gave it 2.5 stars. Alright, and then we get into the readathon, the DA Halloween-a-thon. So I read 10 books during this readathon, and for the prompt, the first one to read a book with a dark cover, I read Red Hood by Alana K. Arnold. I hated this. As you might have guessed, this is a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, and I gave this one 1.5 stars. In this reiteration, we are following Bizu, and she lives with her grandmother in modern day. She is attending a high school dance, and on her way home from the dance, she runs into a wolf in the woods, and somehow manages to kill this wolf with her bare hands. From there, we start to learn about the generations of her family and what her mother and grandmother have gone through, and that they have taken it upon themselves to kind of be the savior and protect the woods and protect the town from these men who turn into wolves. There was a lot I didn't like about this book, writing being one of them. This whole book is told in second person, which I actually like second person a lot of the time, but I don't think it worked for this book, and it was not a very nice experience kind of listening to it, especially with the stilted, awkward, and just very strange tale that this book unfolded. It was also quite strange because, of course, the protagonist is you. You, the reader, kind of become the protagonist. You become Bizu, and in that aspect and kind of regard, it seems like you don't really get to know her. You don't get to know what she's like. To top it all off, I really did not agree with kind of the message and the take that this book took on the retelling of this fairy tale, especially after reading We Should All Be Feminists, which was such a wonderful, clear read. Red Hood really took it the whole other way, and this whole other path that definitely isn't about equality, but just seems to be about killing people in the woods. It was actually quite frightening because our main character Bizu, eventually you see her get very kind of power hungry and craving to kill these wolves who are really actually just people. And of course, even though they've done awful things and they are portrayed as being quite villainous, and they are, she just simply wants to kill them, destroy them. And it was just a really weird experience kind of seeing her descend into kind of being this monster. So for those reasons, I'm out. The nonfiction that I read this month is Why Buddhism is True by Robert Wright. Now this title is quite the title, however it does not mean true in the sense of kind of comparing it or placing it against different religions or different philosophies or anything like that. It simply means true in the objective true of reality. What is objectively true? What is reality? Which was so interesting. This author actually wrote one of the books that the director of The Matrix made Keanu Reeves read to prepare for his role as Neo, about truth and about philosophy. And this one was so interesting because it takes Buddhism and it takes it and looks at it through the light of evolutionary psychology, which was so interesting in terms of natural selection and how your brain has been designed and curated and manipulated by natural selection, which does not care about reality. It cares about propagating genes. So it was just so illuminating, so frightening as well, because we all engage and we all live in this world and we all have these brains that have been created by things that aren't necessarily objectively true or even useful anymore, and can actually be quite harmful. So it goes through all of these illusions that we tell ourselves, all of these delusions that our brain has created and continuously each and every day kind of pulls up for us. It was just honestly a really helpful, illuminating book. I loved it so much. I love the author's own kind of personal take and journey that he puts in there. It's never too much, it's never in your face, it's just very quiet contemplation of what has happened evolutionarily in us, and it was amazing. I'm very much looking forward to reading more books of his because this was so good. It was so good. 4 stars. Next, I got to read Kiki's Delivery Service, which I'm so glad I did. This book was a dream. It was a charm. A charm? It was charming. If you've seen the movie or read the book, you know that we follow Kiki, who is she 12? I think she's a 12-year-old girl, and she's a witch. And every coming of age ceremony for a witch, you have to leave your family and go find a new town to live in for a whole year and be their local witch, try and help them with anything, do things for them, and just create this engaging relationship with the people of that town. So Kiki and her cat Gigi, we get to follow them along as they fly and pick out this new town. Now, witches typically have kind of like 2 powers. One of Kiki's is of course flying, and unfortunately she's never been able to discover or to get a different power within herself. So she has to be a bit smart and creative and decides to create this delivery service. We follow her trying to win over the townspeople, and we follow her through problems and situations and being homesick and just everything, and it was so wholesome and pure and wonderful, and it made me so happy, and I loved it so much. I really recommend if you're feeling down, if you want something happy. So good. 4 stars. Then I read the graphic novel Sheets by Brenna Thumler to fulfill the prompt of reading a book with supernatural themes. I really don't have too much to say about it other than that I did really love the art style and the relationship between Wendell and Marjorie. Wendell is a ghost, Marjorie is a young girl who manages her family's laundromat, and one day their paths cross, they meet. I do want to say, and I do want to like just warn you, it is a very sad book. It is so sad. It really brought me down because about 85% of this book is just really sad. There's so many sad things that go on in here. It deals with a lot of grief and loss. However, I did really enjoy it. I thought it did turn out to be quite wholesome, so I gave it 4 stars. And there's some really beautiful artwork in here that I think I'm gonna be pulling out soon, so that is Sheets. I read Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn to fulfill the prompt of reading by candlelight because I wanted it to be a bit of a spookier book. The word I learned from Sharp Objects is bucolic, which means relating to or typical of rural life. It comes from Latin bucolicus, which actually comes from the Greek bucolikos, because bukolos means cowherd, bus meaning head of the cattle, and kolos meaning to cultivate. So I've really been thinking more about Sharp Objects. I initially gave it 3 stars, but I think I might bump it up to at least 3.5. In Sharp Objects, we follow Camille, who is a reporter, and she gets an assignment that takes her back to her hometown in Wind Gap, Missouri, which she hates. She hates going back here, she hates living there, she hates everything about it, but the assignment is to write upon and try and get statements and stuff like that about the murders of these 2 young girls, because now people are considering and thinking that it might be a serial killer in Wind Gap, in the little town. She stays with her mother, who she has quite the questionable relationship with, as well as her stepfather and stepsister. In terms of the mystery aspect of this book, I knew kind of who the killer was and what was happening almost immediately. I think that's probably the case with most readers, and that's not necessarily the point, because this is a book with a lot of creepy factors and a lot of really unsettling, disgusting, and squeamish inducing things going on. The writing was very interesting. I love unreliable narrators, which this book featured, as well as the fact that our protagonist Camille will suddenly drop these things on you and things will suddenly like be revealed. This tarp will be so quickly ripped down from this thing that you didn't know, and you're just there facing it as the reader, and a lot of times you weren't prepared for that and you didn't know that was coming, and so that was really interesting. I love that aspect of the writing. Some other things that this book talks about that I really did enjoy was factory farming, actually, which is horrifying in and of itself, but to see it in a horror book, or at least a book that I would call horrifying, was such a compelling, unsettling read. And the way that factory farming, not only in the abuse of animals and the really awful things that go on in these places and in these companies, but the effects that it has on us as people, not only the people who are working in these farms and in these slaughterhouses, but in terms of dietary and nutrition effects, I suppose. That was really, really interesting. This book deals a lot with different kinds and forms of sickness, and that was really hard to see and really hard to read as well. So unsettling the way that sickness slides underneath the skin of the people in this book, and it was just horrifying. There's a lot in here about bullying and harassment, and how particularly, at least for Camille, these small town kind of groups and mentalities can lead to such huge acts of violence, both physical and mental. So yeah, there's just a lot in here that is really hard to deal with and really hard to read and horrifying from so many different angles. So that is Sharp Objects. Yeah. Next, I read Strange Fiction by H.G. Wells, which is a very short collection of a few of his sci-fi stories and supernatural takes and tales. I gave this 3 stars. I wasn't super thrilled with it. I don't really find myself ever super thrilled with H.G. Wells novels or works, but there were a few short stories in here that I did enjoy, and it's always really interesting reading science fiction from this period and from these authors. So that is Strange Fiction. I read This Is How You Lose the Time War, and I really did enjoy this. This is a short, I guess it's kind of like a novella of science fiction and romance, because we're following Blue and Red, and they are both parts of their respective warring, I guess, factions and agencies and stuff like that are trying to manipulate human history in very small ways over a very long time, and they're doing that via their 2 time-traveling agents who they send back and forth through these streams and through these threads of human history and what has gone on in Earth's timeline and everything like that. It was so interesting. I wouldn't recommend this to everyone. I think I've said before, the writing is it's like really hard to conceptualize and to picture. It's not writing that makes you feel very stable in this world or like you really know what's happening. It's very beautiful, very flowery writing, because most of this book is composed in love letters between these 2 women, and it was just really nice, really, really nice, really heartbreaking, and I loved everything that's going on. I think this is a book I would have preferred to have read physically rather than listening to the audiobook of, so I might have to do that sometime in the future, because I think there's a lot that I missed, and kind of seeing what particular changes these women are trying to bring about in history to change the future and to change the final outcome of humanity in their favor. That was really interesting, because they use a lot of course, real history and real events that have gone down. For example, the assassination of Caesar and Columbus coming to the Americas and everything like that. So really interesting. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I listened to the absolutely wonderful full cast audiobook of The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. I'm so glad I was able to fit this in October. I absolutely loved it. I gave it 5 stars. I was not expecting to like it as much as I did, but I adored this. One of my favorite Neil Gaimans. This and Coraline have my whole entire halves of my heart. So in The Graveyard Book, we were following this young boy named Bod, which is short for nobody. His entire family, his mother and father, have been killed by this man called Jack. Bod is taken in by the local ghosts of this graveyard near to the house where his parents were murdered in, and he is brought up and grown up in this graveyard, and if he ever leaves the man, Jack will be back trying to find him and kill him. I love the writing. I loved the pacing. I loved all of the characters. I got so emotionally attached to everyone. Neil Gaiman, at least in this book, is just so expert at like creating heartstrings you didn't know you have and then absolutely just ripping them to shreds, but it's fine. I'm fine. There were a few small aspects near the end, namely what happens with a character called Scarlet that I didn't enjoy. If you've read this book, you probably know what I'm talking about, but other than that, it was so nice seeing Bod grow up and to see the ghosts and the ghouls of this graveyard. I loved the little aspects of what living in a cemetery would actually entail and how you would go about it, and all of the things that would be explained to you and stuff that, of course, a boy being educated by these like Victorian and Renaissance and very old ghosts wouldn't know and would have to explore and learn for himself in the world. So this was just really heartwarming. I loved it. It was also very scary, quite spooky. What goes on with, of course, the killer and everything like that, the villain, actually quite horrifying. So yeah, Neil Gaiman always just combines both in equal measure, and I loved it, and I gave it 5 stars. And that is a graveyard book. Alright, so the second last book that I read in October, I gave the most generous 3 stars of my life to Wicked Saints by Emily A. Duncan. I think the word I learned from Wicked Saints perfectly describes how I feel about this book as well, because the word is callow, which means lacking adult sophistication or immature. This word comes from Middle English callu, which means bald. Wait. Do you think that's why Caillou is called Caillou? No. Callu? Caillou. Because like Caillou's pretty bald. I think I just had an epiphany. Right, okay, so it comes from Middle English, callu, which means bald, which comes from Old English and Old High German, callow. I don't know if it's pronounced callow, it might be pronounced Caillou. Which means bald as well, with a K. And then that comes from Old Church Slavonic, golu. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it either, but golu means bear. I'm really gonna have to look this up. I'm gonna look this up after, and if I find something, I'll let you know, because I don't know. I might just be making this up, but anyway. Right, so Wicked Saints follows this girl. It's actually honestly it's just Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, like extremely similar. We're following this girl named Nadezhda, and she lives in this monastery, and she is the most powerful girl in this world. She is the only living cleric because she can pray to the gods, the pantheon of gods in this fantasy world, and receive magic and work power through the gods. The country and the kingdom next to hers, Trinavia, they are heretics and they are blood mages because they work magic through spellbooks and cutting themselves, bleeding on their spellbooks, and whipping out their magic that way, which apparently is a no-go with the gods. This book opens immediately with soldiers from Trinavia and the High Prince, who is the most powerful blood mage in this world, attacking the monastery where Nadezhda lives. She flees with her friend named Anna, and eventually they encounter this group of people in the woods, in the snow, in the cold, and they team up because they both have the common goal of killing the king of Trinavia to try and bring balance and peace back to these two countries, because the king of Trinavia is very corrupt and is waging this war that is really hurting both nations. I have so many problems with this book. Number one, the writing was really, really lackluster, especially the writing of the characters of Nadezhda, of the High Prince Seraphim, who is one of the points of view that we follow, and of Malachias, who is someone else that is one of the people Nadezhda is with in the woods and takes her to Trinavia. The attributes and the writing and the descriptions of these people, they like maxed out one attribute until that became all these people were. For Nadezhda, the author like maxed out her religious beliefs until that was all she was. Her whole persona was denying Malachias, who is a heretic, and fighting against him and saying, I shouldn't do this, I shouldn't trust you, I should kill you because I'm faithful, because I'm a cleric, because I'm this. And it was repeated relentlessly and ruthlessly over and over again until like it became meaningless. And that's kind of all her personality was, and it just felt so unreal because people aren't just one thing. The same can be said for Malachias and Seraphim in that kind of their beliefs and their mission, which was attached to their beliefs, became all they were as well. I didn't love the writing, I didn't love the pacing. I gave it really generous 3 stars because it was really entertaining, and I did eventually come to enjoy the relationship between Nadezhda and Malachias, but for most of it was just really, really lackluster. Another thing I really did not enjoy and still cannot figure out is that this book was so confusing to me. I really didn't know what was going on in terms of the plans that some of these characters were creating and why these plans entailed and needed Nadezhda, Nadia, to be in them and to be there. It really didn't make sense. Once this book got to Trinavia and gets to the other kingdom, I really could not tell you why anything that happens. I can't really explain to you the lore or why things go down or even the plots and the missions that were being carried out or why they were being carried out, because it kind of just became this really confusing tangle this really weedy, grassy area where like I really didn't know why things were happening, which was really, really frustrating. And I think there were actually quite a number of plot holes or just plot divots where I didn't really know what was happening or couldn't figure out why specifically and why necessarily something had to be happening this way, because it really didn't seem like it did, if that makes sense, without spoiling anything. So honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe 2.5 stars, but I will probably continue the series just to see if I can make sense of what actually happened or why things happened the way it happened. Anyway, that's Wicked Saints. And finally, the last book I read this month is the wonderful gothic old tale of The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. I gave this 4 stars. I loved it, although I do really want to say it was the weirdest, wackiest gothic tale I've read. It was kind of like going to this strange haunted mansion where you have like a room of mirrors and then suddenly you walk into a different doorway and you have this like revolving, you know, that revolving circular weird thing. It was kind of like that, like things would just pop out and things would happen and you weren't really sure what sort of ghoulish or ghostly things or supernatural elements you were really going to encounter in here until they met you, and they were just there. Something I didn't love about this book was the overall general writing. It was definitely very blunt. There were a few quotes that I loved, but I was kind of hoping for more description actually, and more kind of flowing, nice prose and paragraphs and description, and you don't really get that with The Castle of Otranto. So this begins with the Prince of Otranto, Manfred, who is quite the villain, trying to marry his son Conrad off to the Princess Isabella. Conrad is immediately crushed by a giant helmet, and from there we see Manfred really panicking because there is a prophecy about the principality and about the people of Otranto, the people who are occupying it, Manfred being that person at the moment, of what will happen to them. So in answer and to try and avoid this prophecy, he turns to Isabella. Isabella runs and flees, and from there we follow this weird tangled web of things that go on. Lots of people arrive at the castle, lots of people leave the castle. We're introduced to this whole cast of characters who are quite interconnected, and their stories weave and wind between each other. At times it's a bit difficult to follow. I think at least the first read through of this book. Something that happens over and over again in this book is this like mistaken identity, people thinking someone is someone else. It's kind of like that Hamlet moment in Hamlet where Hamlet stabs Polonius through the curtain. It's kind of incidents like that that go on. That was so repetitive, and this whole theme of mistaken identity and appearance really is present in this book, which I loved. I love exploring that, so that was cool. The word that I learned from here is opprobrium, which means something that brings disgrace. I gave this book 4 stars. I'm really glad that I witnessed kind of one of the first gothic novels and finally got to see what it was all about. Those are finally all of the books I read this month. Thank you so much for watching. If you stayed this long, oh my gosh, I hope you got yourself multiple cups of tea or coffee. I hope you're doing well. Let me know, as always, what your favorite book of the month was, because I love knowing what you guys are reading. Thank you so much for joining in on the readathon. I hope you had fun. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you very shortly in my next video. Ciao.